Welcome to episode 51 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, if you listen to episode 50, you'll remember that it was all recorded on location, and it was all about me cycling from Morecambe on the west coast of England to York via Lancaster along the Way of the Roses. That was really a bit of a shakedown for me in terms of my plans for the summer. My plan, and I'll be leaving hopefully on the 2nd of July, is to catch the ferry to Rotterdam. And, well, my initial plan was to head to the Baltic, but a few months ago I changed my mind and decided instead to turn right upon arrival in Rotterdam and head to France. And this is something actually I discussed with Rob Ainsley in episode 49 of the podcast. So if you go back and listen to that one, you'll hear me kind of justifying why I decided to change my plans. But anyway, now that I've made the decision, I needed to start thinking more about cycling in France. All three of my previous long trips, back in 2010, 2013 and 2015, they involved a bit of cycling in France, but I've managed to come up with a route that actually doesn't really take me back to the places that I've previously visited. And this podcast is all going to be about cycling in France, and you'll hear in the discussion that's about to come up some of the details of the route that I'll be taking. You can also find much more details about the route that I'll be taking and my plans for the summer if you visit the website cyclingeurope.org/Le Grand Tour. That's what I've named it, the big tour in French, Le Grand Tour. Now, when it comes to planning a bike trip in France, there's one person whose name springs to mind, and she is Lyn Eyb. She's the person who runs the website freewheelingfrance.com. And earlier today, I arranged to have a chat with her. I think that for anybody who is thinking of cycling in France, either this year or in the future, what she says is invaluable. So we'll come to the conversation I had in a few moments, but just to say, keep listening to the end, because after my recorded conversation with Lyn, I'll just be filling you in on my plans in terms of the podcast for when I actually do arrive on the continent for the 2 months that I'm going to be away. So keep listening right to the end. But in the meantime, I did as I normally do, and I asked Lyn to start off by introducing herself.
My name's Lyn Eyb, and I live east of Bordeaux in France, where we've been since the end of 2008. We first came to Bordeaux with my husband's job. We had a daughter who was 11 months old at the time, and I was trying to navigate Bordeaux on my bike with her on the back and to do it safely. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of information out there for cycling in France, or even in Bordeaux or France generally, in English. A lot of the tourist board websites, for example, hadn't translated their content. So as a non-native and somebody who had very, very basic French at the time, I was having trouble finding information about cycling with my daughter. So I basically started a blog answering questions from myself that I thought was interesting, finding routes and other bits and pieces about cycling in Bordeaux. And then I started getting emails from other people who were asking similar questions and wanting me to find out information for them. So I just kept putting it on the blog, and it kind of evolved and grew into what is freewheelingfrance.com, which is the website I run now. So it's been going up and going since probably about 2009, and it's in that time pretty much taken on a life of its own. I started by adding information that I found useful and that other people were asking, and then I just kept growing it. And now it just covers all sorts of information about cycling in France, just cycling in France for fun. I don't cover cycle sport in that we don't, follow the Tour de France in a cycling sport capacity, like who's winning and that sort of thing, or teams. But I do cover information like spectating on the Tour de France to make it easy for people to come and watch it, or cycling Ventoux or Alpe d'Huez. But it's very much a leisure cycling for fun website, whether you're a cycle tourist or a road biker or a mountain biker, just like to have something for everybody on the site. Mostly though, it's cycle tourism. It's people wanting to cycle from A to B, or maybe have a fixed base in Provence or Normandy and cycle out every day to see the sights.
And we're going to talk about the various routes around France in a few minutes. But just before we get to that, you're not French, obviously, you're Australian. Were you a cyclist when you were growing up in Australia?
I had a bike and I rode a lot. I grew up in regional Australia in a small town, not unlike the town we're in here in France, really, just a small village in a quiet cul-de-sac. I rode my bike to school, rode my bike to see my grandma on the weekends, that sort of thing. And then, like most people, many people, I think, sort of when you hit your teenage years, you maybe drop out of cycling a bit, you catch the bus a bit further to school, to high school, and you move away from it a little bit. So it wasn't really until I moved to London in year 2000 that I got a bike and started commuting across London, which is when I got back into cycling. And I cycled off and on over the years for a good 5-6 year period in London. I worked for the London Cycling Campaign for a little while as well, editing their magazine. By trade, I'm a journalist and editor, so that worked in nicely with some freelancing that I was doing at the time. So I was editing their magazine for a few years before I moved to France. So in that way, the website has followed on nicely. I obviously had a little bit of background in publishing, had never done web publishing before, had never worked online at the time. So it transitioned me into web publishing a bit and writing for online, which was lovely, tied in nicely with what I enjoyed doing anyway. So yeah, so when we moved to France, I continued cycling here really. I was wanting to continue cycling, which is how the website evolved. But yeah, in London, I cycled quite a bit and went into my pregnancy, in fact, until I was 6 or 7 months pregnant in London, until I decided that it was, at the time, I was not so comfortable once I sort of reached that 7 month part. But delighted when we moved to France and found out that it was such a pleasure to ride. And even on busy streets in Bordeaux, for example, there was capacity for cycling and for sharing the roads a bit more, and dedicated lanes, and a wonderful riverfront that was just open for cycling and skating and walking. It was just a revelation that we arrived, and it was just, wow, this is just something that we need to keep doing and keep enjoying.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I used to live in France during the 1990s. I definitely had a bike. Didn't do anything really long distance, but it is a good place. In fact, it's a very good place to be a cyclist. Now, just to put our conversation in context today, we were in contact probably about 10, 11, 12 years ago, because I actually wrote something for Freewheeling France about the Eurovelos. There were a fewer then, back in 2010, 2011, than there are now. But I wrote something for your website. And then in 2015, when I was cycling from Spain up to Norway, I met you in Saumur in the Loire Valley. And I think what we'll do, before we go any further, we're just going to listen to me reading an extract from the book that I wrote, Spain to Norway, about the day when we actually met up in Saumur. And as you'll hear, I wasn't in a particularly good mood, I don't think. So cue the cheesy French music, and here's me retelling the story of that day when we met back in 2015. The 12th degree, 47 to 48 degrees north. The 9th to the 15th of May, 2015. Upon arrival in Saumur in 1993 as an employee of Eurocamp, I discovered a delightful, quintessentially Loire Valley town, complete with fairy tale castle, medieval squares, and lots of sparkling wine. I also discovered a great municipal campsite on an island in the middle of the Loire where I worked during that long, hot summer season. 20 years later, the town had barely changed, or so it seemed. Compines-Île-Dauphin, on the other hand, had changed significantly. It had been privatised, and was no longer run by the local council. Gone were the open-air swimming pool, condamné according to the receptionist, the shop run by friendly Jean-Claude, and the incomparable views of the chateau. That's not quite true. The view was still there, but you had to be staying for more than one night to be allowed to camp on the hallowed part of the site from where you could appreciate it. I was allocated a pitch on the other side of the island with a less than majestic view of a green metal fence and some bushes. But enough reminiscing. I had a bike to mend. With most of what I was carrying deposited at the campsite, I cycled into town to locate Vélo Spot, a bike shop that I had found earlier online. J'ai quelques problèmes avec le bottom bracket, I explained to Patrice, the owner of the shop, struggling with my bike-related vocabulary. Of more use to Patrice was my finger, which was pointing at le bottom bracket. Le jeu de pédalier, he suggested. Oui, c'est ça. Oui, je peux le changer, he replied. Et le stand? Je ne sais pas comment dire stand en français, I admitted. As for le bit of plastic that holds the cat-eye computer to the frame, I didn't even attempt its French translation and just let my finger do the talking. Up close, Saumur wasn't looking quite as good as it had done from the other side of the river. The rose-tinted sunglasses of time could play cruel tricks on the mind, and the years of growing up from being a 20-something casual campsite worker to being a 40-something middle-aged grump had me noticing every crumbling pavement, every piece of discarded litter, and every abandoned shop. The Trianon restaurant, my favourite, had closed, and the bar where we used to challenge the locals at pool on the Place Saint-Pierre was now a busy, upmarket bistro. The rest of the square was filled with trendy, bright young things, creating memories that they would one day look back upon and cherish unjustifiably. I picked up Reggie late in the afternoon and cycled him back to the campsite, praying that the clicking had disappeared. The journey was short and he was unladen. Everything seemed to be okay. I dined alone on a baguette, some cheese, and a bottle of wine, next to the fence and the bushes. I'd been looking forward so much to this portion of the trip, but so far it had turned me into a melancholic reminiscer of days that were probably nowhere near as good as I remembered them. Was this the shape of things to come over the next week or so as I made my way along the familiar Loire Valley to Paris? In the morning, my mood remained low. Upon being served a croissant in a local boulangerie by a woman who gave every impression of having just lost her entire family in a plane crash, I didn't hold back. S'il vous plaît, madame, soyez poli avec vos clients. I was impressed with my use of the imperative as I admonished her for her attitude. The customer behind me was impressed with my courage in saying what I did. He smiled discreetly, but the recipient of my words was not impressed. She glared at me and remained silent, but I could read her mind, which was shouting, "Get out." I needed to relax, chat to someone and smile. Fortunately, I'd arranged to meet Lyn from the cycling website freewheelingfrance.com. Lyn, an Australian by birth, was now based near Bordeaux, and we had only ever communicated online, so it was good to put a face to a name. She happened to be in Saumur because she was also cycling La Vélo Francette with a friend, in anticipation of its official inauguration the following month. Over coffee and a croissant, we chewed the fat of being on the road, the highs, the lows, the miserable bastards who ran local boulangerie. Her positive Aussie spin on life shamed me. What did I have to complain about? I was on a cycling odyssey across a continent, travelling through gorgeous landscapes, visiting beautiful villages, towns and cities, and meeting people who were almost always charming, helpful and polite. I didn't have much to complain about at all. So that was back in 2015 when we met in Saumur in France. Now, as I mentioned there, you were, or we were both actually, because I'd just come from La Rochelle and I'd been following La Vélo Français. And as I mentioned in the book, you were also following La Vélo Français as well. Can you give us an overview of the various routes that exist in France currently? La Vélo Français is one of them, but there are quite a few of these named routes, aren't there?
There are. And it can get confusing because some of them do double up with the Eurovelo routes that you mentioned previously. So the Eurovelo was obviously the European network of bike routes. But then within France, each of these sections of the Eurovelo tends to have a bit of a life of its own. So, for instance, Eurovelo 1, which is the European route that follows the Atlantic coast here in France, but goes all the way to the north of Europe and down into Spain from France, is called the Velo d'Issy here. So they all have their own little branding and their own little patterns of life, I suppose, when they come into France, and that's purely for local marketing reasons, and for people cycling them locally, I suppose, as well, who are not necessarily doing the whole European odyssey. So you have the Eurovelo routes, and they're I guess the core, cycling highways, if you like to call them that, the velo routes through France. But then you do have a lot of regional, local routes, the Velo Français, as you mentioned, which goes from La Rochelle up to Normandy. There's a network of local bike routes in Burgundy, for instance, the Tour de Burgundy. It's a fabulous series of routes. It's not one route. It's a combination of various routes that all link up. A lot of them following the canals and the vineyards, but definitely signposted and very easy to navigate. The Vélociny that you mentioned as well, which goes from Mont Saint-Michel down into Paris. There's the Avenue Verte, which goes from Dieppe in Normandy and in fact goes all the way to London from the other side of the channel to Paris. It's endless. It really, really is endless. Each region basically now in France has its own cycle network. In Gironde around Bordeaux, there's a whole, it's a figure 8 type Tour de Gironde network that comes in off the coast from the Eurovelo 1 and explores the vineyards and goes to the south of Bordeaux. And a lot of these interlink. So, for example, the Tour de Charente, which comes north of Bordeaux into La Rochelle, extends out to the Cognac, and again interacts with the Eurovelo 1 on the coast. So there's a lot of this interaction going on in that you could use the Eurovelo network certainly as your main planning tool, which I think is largely what you've done with your next trip. But then people wanting diversions or detours can always then branch out and take these other local routes in order to get a bit of variety or get off the main track. I always recommend there's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful hard copy map. And as much as websites and apps have evolved over the last few years, I still have a special spot in my heart for paper maps. But the IGN, which is the French equivalent of the UK Ordnance Survey Organization, the IGN, creates this wonderful map that takes in all of France and it covers the entire cycling network. So Eurovelo routes as well as all of these local routes. And it shows how they interact. So it's called the Voies Verts and Veloroute de France IGN map. It's map 924 for your listeners, Andrew. So I really, really recommend if anybody's looking at France and looking for different routes or looking to navigate France using the network of cycle routes. And it's a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous place to start and available online or at good bookshops and map shops. It's endless. It really, really is endless. And it's one of the things that makes France wonderful is the fact that, you can pretty much get anywhere on a bike if you want to.
Here in Britain, we have, well, mainly Sustrans who look after the National Cycle Network. But in France, is there an equivalent organisation that works on a national level that organises, coordinates all the different routes, or is it very much left to regional and local government?
It's quite fragmented. Obviously, you have the Eurovelo infrastructure. So within that, there's French organisations that work in order to make the Eurovelo work here and roll out those networks here. There's an association called the AF3V, the Veloroute et Voies Vertes Association, and they oversee a lot of this stuff, and they have their maps and they do a lot of route planning, a lot of lobbying and local activism, I suppose you would call it. But in terms of the rolling out of a lot of this infrastructure, it very much is down to a regional level, which is why sometimes when you were following, say, a Eurovelo route, for example, probably not so much now that the routes have so much more developed, but certainly 5, 10 years ago, you would be following a Eurovelo route and you would cross a regional border and suddenly the signage would not be as impressive or would not be complete, for example. And it does happen now with some of these interregional routes. If you're crossing a border, you will notice that the signage maybe has stopped because that is all rolled out locally on a regional level. So it's very much a bit fragmented, but it works. Some regions and some tourist boards are a lot more active than others. For example, if you go to Provence or Brittany, Normandy, Loire, just off the top of my head, four that were streets and streets and streets ahead of many other regions in terms of cycling infrastructure. And often it's because they invested very early in cycling officers or special units within the tourist board that were responsible for rolling out cycling infrastructure. And they would go out and they would talk to accommodation providers about how to make a B&B or a hotel bike friendly, or how to put a garage in, for example, to make sure bikes were safe, as well as planning local routes and ensuring that the funding was available. So yeah, it does vary, but by and by, certainly now compared to 10 years ago, nearly every tourist board or every region is on board in terms of cycling and ensuring that it's something that's a priority, because it's a massive, massive, massive generator now of income for France and for the French tourism generally. I think after walking holidays, cycling generates more income and more tourist dollars than any other activity, including skiing, from my understanding. So it is a massive, and it's not just because of the Tour de France. Obviously, a lot of that comes from the Tour de France and the profile that comes from that, the race, but generally it is just because the nation has developed this reputation as a nice, safe, and affordable place to cycle. And a lot of people often ask me about cycling here in car-free routes, and they want to ride on a route that doesn't have any cars. Yes, a lot of these routes are car-free. They're old converted railway lines, for example, or canal towpaths or river paths that are made good for cycling. But often the roads that we ride on every day and that are on some of these velo routes aren't bike only, because they don't need to be, because they're not busy routes. They've been planned so well that they are back roads that, yes, they're shared by cars and tractors and all sorts of other vehicles, but they're not by and by busy. And I think that's one of the good things about the network here. It's been planned very well so that most of the time, I'm not saying all of the time, but 85-90% of the time, you can follow these maps and these routes, and they are very, very safe, regardless of whether or not you're sharing them with cars.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, because I remember back in 2010 when I cycled to Italy and I was cycling down the edge of France, the eastern edge of France. And what I tried to do, I had Michelin maps. I think the scale was 1 to 200,000, 1 to 300,000, something like that. I was nominally following the Eurovelo 5, but at the time there was no GPS track and there were certainly no signs. So what I knew the vague direction. So to work out my route, I actually just looked at the map and I picked out the yellow routes, which were the minor roads on the Michelin map. And it actually worked really well. I was kept mainly away from traffic and it was a overall positive experience. And, I think it's worth bearing in mind that France is twice the size of Britain, but with roughly the same population. So there is a lot of space out there. And just to catch up on my plans for 2022, which is kind of the motivation for this conversation to begin with. You mentioned it, and what my plan is to get to Rotterdam and basically turn right, go down the coast. And when I was trying to work out my route around France, I was able, like you said, to link up all the different routes more or less continuously. I don't think there are any gaps in what I'm planning, which is basically to go down a route called the Vélo Maritime, which is also the Eurovelo 4, as far as Dieppe, and then hook up with the Avenue Verte, which will take me to Paris, and in Paris, go on the Vélo Scénie, which takes me all the way to Mont Saint-Michel, where I rejoin the Eurovelo 4, and then down the coast as far as Roscoff. And at Roscoff, that's where the Vélodicée, the Eurovelo 1, starts in France, head all the way down to just south of La Rochelle, and then head down to Bordeaux. I think that's one section actually where there isn't any cycle route. Oh no, there is. Sorry. Le Canal des Deux Mers, the Two Seas Canal route, which is the Canal de la Garonne and the Canal du Midi. That will take me all the way down to the Mediterranean, and then hop along the Mediterranean, pick up the Eurovelo 17, which is the Rhone cycle route, or locally it's known as the Via Rhône. And then finally, this is now out of France, hook up with the Eurovelo 15, the Rhine cycle route, and cycle all the way back to Rotterdam following the Rhine. So that's my plan for the summer. But I was delighted to find that I could basically follow all of these routes and come up with a very long distance, continuous path.
And what you'll find, Andrew, as well, is that is a good example, that whole route, of what I was saying about a mix of basically, if you're on a velo route, that is a mix of cars and bikes, but it's very safe and it's been planned out so that it's not a dedicated cycleway, but it's a cycle route that's recommended and you should follow and signposted. And then you'll have in that sections of voies vertes, which is the car-free section. So there'll be some on the you mentioned the two canals route from Bordeaux to the Mediterranean. Much of that, not all of it, maybe 70-80% of it, will be along canal towpaths, and that will be dedicated cycling away from cars. But that entire route is a combination of car-free cycling. A lot of the coast, for example, the Atlantic coast on the Eurovelo 1 there, the Velocity, will be cycling paths along the beaches and so forth, and that'll be shared pedestrian and bikes. But some of that will also be on roads that will be just very quiet and suitable for cycling. So that the whole route is a classic example of how it's possible to get safely around France. And again, back to what you were asking about funding and who funds cycling. I think what makes a route like this work in terms of being a safe plan for you is that when the French authorities have planned these routes out, they've said, actually, we're not going to waste money putting a dedicated cycling lane in here or making this car free, because actually this section of road is actually quite safe. So we'll pop some signs on there and let the motorists know that it's for cyclists as well. And, there'll be occasionally some signposts and some cycling infrastructure, but for the most part, it's fine how it is. And so I think when they distribute the money for cycling infrastructure, it's done in a quite intelligent way. So a lot of money is not wasted on putting infrastructure in place where it's actually not necessary, because as you were saying, a lot of these places are just not well populated. There's not a lot of cars there anyway, which makes them ideal for cycling in a very organic sense.
The other thing I was going to mention, apart from your excellent website, which is freewheelingfrance.com, each of these named routes, the Vélodyssée, the Via Rhône, the Vélocénie, they have excellent websites dedicated to that particular route, and they're all kind of in the same format. So you can see there's some kind of coordination going on there, but actually they're really good websites. They give you details, they give you GPS tracks, etc., along with accommodation options and information about the various places that they pass through. So it's certainly, obviously, I would recommend your website first, but certainly their websites are a useful resource as well. How do you find being a cyclist in France? Do you personally find it a good experience, not necessarily long distance wise, but just simply, when you're cycling down to the boulangerie for your baguette?
Well, yeah, we cycle every day. My son, he's 11 now. Well, both my kids, my son's 11, my daughter's now 14. They've been, well, as I mentioned, when we arrived in Bordeaux, my daughter was 11 months old, so I had her on the back of my bike. So they've both been cyclists since they were in nappies. When we arrived here east of Bordeaux, when we moved out of the city, we've come to this little village, and they were going to the local school. So we had a bike and a trailer, and we'd go to school in the bike and in the trailer every day until they were able to ride their own bikes. And then for a while, when we're about, I guess it's a 3-kilometer round trip to school. So when they were little cyclists, but not probably big enough to do the whole trip themselves, we'd ride halfway, and then we'd pop the bike at the back of the trailer and then pop the kid in the trailer, and we'd ride the rest of the way that way. So they've always been cyclists. Every day, pretty much, we've been on bikes since we've been in France, and my 11-year-old rides to school now. We ride to school together, and it's just a normal part of life for us. It's not, something we even probably consider, and certainly don't regard ourselves as cyclists, I don't think. We just ride bikes, and we ride bikes for fun, and I think that's part of the ethos of what I try to do with the website. I don't like this distinction that somebody's a cyclist, and I think you get it in cities a lot more than in the country or outside of the major cities, maybe with commuters, where there's this more of a tension between cars and bikes, but where somebody's a cyclist or somebody is a motorist. But I don't really see cycling in that sense. I just see people riding bikes. There's a guy down the road who's one of the local farmers here, and he rides his bike around. He's got his beret on and his old ancient Peugeot bike, and it must be much older than me, his bike. And he rides around. I don't regard him as a cyclist. He's just a local farmer who rides his bike. And I think that's a nice way to think about it. And that's, I think, generally how people regard cycling here. It's just a different way of thinking about it, I think. And I think it's a nice way to approach it.
The Dutch have perhaps reached the highest level of nobody is a cyclist because that they don't think that way. They are simply people who ride bikes. And I think in Britain we're kind of towards the other end of the spectrum where there is a divide. Although the majority of cyclists do drive cars, it's not the other way around. That certainly not the majority of motorists use bikes. And I think there's still a bit of an us and them. Well, a bit of another us and them. I think there's a lot of it here in Britain. And it sounds as though in France, and from what I've experienced in France, it's probably closer to the Dutch experience than the British experience.
I think so, and certainly outside of the cities. I can't speak so much for the cities. I've ridden a little bit in Paris and Bordeaux, and obviously cities when I've been riding through. But I don't have a heavy commuter experience in terms of the cities here. But certainly in terms of just enjoying being out on the bike, I've never ever experienced any road rage. In fact, and I had a conversation with somebody on Twitter recently about this. They were asking about drivers and cars in France and how safe it was, and I said, in fact, it's probably the other extreme. Like, I hear a lot of this road rage, people going past and not giving cyclists enough room in some other countries. But here, in fact, sometimes it's the opposite extreme. You'll be riding down a country lane and there's this car behind you, and it will sit there for, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of meters until it gets to a next turn off because it doesn't want to go past you, or it doesn't want to, interrupt your cycling or make you feel uncomfortable. So we now locally get into the habit of obviously waving cars through because, it can be the other end of the spectrum sometimes where it's actually quite frustrating to have this car sat behind you for an inordinate amount of time because they don't want to go past you and make you feel uncomfortable. So you can't have everything, I suppose. There's nothing perfect in life, but I'd much prefer have that experience than somebody beeping their horn. And I've certainly never, ever, ever been beeped at or honked at in terms of, any sort of road rage incident in France. The only toots I've ever got is when I've been going up a hill and somebody's come past as a bit of encouragement to try to get me up the hill. So in that respect, it's certainly a pleasant and just a stress-free way of seeing the countryside.
It's interesting that you mentioned Twitter a few moments ago because we did try to record this conversation. Was it Thursday of last week, a few days ago? But the internet connection between West Yorkshire and Bordeaux was not brilliant, and it's not 100% today. It's now Sunday morning. It's not 100% today, and as a result of me failing to record it a few days ago, I did put a tweet out saying, if anybody's got any questions that they'd like to ask Lyn, this is on Twitter, then please, you've now got a few days before I actually try again to ask those questions. And quite a few people came forward, and we're just going to go through the questions that people asked. So the first one came from a chap called Eric Hittinger. Hope I pronounced that right. And I think this is probably a common topic of conversation on your website. He says, how does he get bikes around France? The TGV is great for moving humans, but what's the best solution for fast and safe moving of bikes?
Okay, so firstly, he's mentioned the TGV, which is the fast trains. They're obviously not bullet trains like in Japan, but they're that kind of intercity express type service. And they do move people very quickly, but they do move bikes. Okay, so it's not true that TGVs don't take bikes. They do take bikes, but it depends on the line. For example, Paris to Bordeaux, Paris to Toulouse, easy with a TGV and a bike. You do need to book your bike in advance. So you need to buy your ticket and book your bike at the same time as getting your ticket. You can't book your own ticket and then add a bike on later. That's very, very difficult. So on some of these lines, perfectly fine to book your bike on. It's a €10 surcharge to book a bike on. There's a space in the carriage for your bike, and spaces are limited. So obviously, if you're going in a big group of people and you all want to take your bikes, it can become difficult because there are a limited number of bike spaces on each TGV. So you might have to split up into small groups, for example, and take two trains a couple of hours apart if you're in a larger group. Also, always obviously recommend, because you need to reserve the bike space, to book as far ahead as you can if you want to take a TGV. Now, some areas of France are not as friendly in terms of taking a fast train with a bike. Provence is the most obvious example. Very, very difficult to get from Paris to Nice, Paris to Avignon, Paris to Marseille with your bike on a TGV. There's one overnight train a day that goes from Paris to Nice and back. It's an overnight service, leaves Nice 7 p.m. in the evening, thereabouts, or 8 p.m. from Paris if you're going the other way, and it goes overnight. It's an intercities train. So it's not a TGV, but it's the next rung on the ladder down in the train hierarchy of France. So it's not as fast as a TGV, and it stops at more stations, but it's not a local service that stops at every station. So it's in the middle. There's one of those, for example, to Nice every day, and that also takes bikes, and you need to book in advance to get your bike on, and spaces are limited. So that's very difficult if you book at the last minute. The other option on some of these lines that don't take bikes on TGVs is to take a TER, which is a local train. It's the same, the equivalent of in England, if you were to get a local train, one stop to your next village. It's exactly the same thing. It's just a local service. They all take bikes. Easiest way to get around France with your bike is on a TER local service. But the caveat obviously is that it's also the slowest. You know, if you're going from Normandy to Provence on a TER, it involves many, many changes, and it's going to be very slow. And in terms of going from somewhere like Brittany to somewhere like Marseille, potentially you will have to take an overnight stay somewhere en route because the connections may not meet up. So that's your most slow travel option, I suppose, if you're just in no hurry and you want to get from A to B.
Can I just say that I think most cyclists probably don't mind traveling slowly. I mean, the fact that they're on a bike in the first place implies, I mean, this is certainly true for me, implies that you don't mind going on a train that just trundles through the French countryside, because basically that's what you're doing on a bike anyway. And it's not just in France. I've been on trains in Spain, in Germany, and a few other countries, and I would just, my default option would always be to go and seek out those regional local trains, because they tend to be a bit like in Britain, although it's a bit fragmented here. But even in Britain here, I live in the north of England, and Northern Trains is a really easy company to deal with, because you just kind of turn up and put your bike on the train. There's no formality. And I always get the impression that that's the case with the regional trains in France and elsewhere in Europe as well.
Exactly. And I love it. It's wonderful. And the good thing about that concept and that style of travel is that if it's raining one day, or your legs are tired, or you've not had enough for breakfast, you just pop to the nearest train station, wait for the next train, and skip a few kilometers by going to your B&B or your hotel by train and not having to cycle. There's no rule that you have to go everywhere on a bike if you're on a cycling holiday. You can take shortcuts like that. The only thing I would say in terms of that is I get a lot of emails from people who don't realize that it takes a lot of time, or they don't realize the TGV doesn't take bikes on their route, and they've not left enough time in their journey. So they've got a ferry booked in Calais for Tuesday, and it's Monday today. How do I get there today? And they're in Marseille, and it's like, well, it's going to be difficult. So if you are relying on trains and you do need to take a slow train, or you're going to a more, not obscure, because Provence is not obscure, obviously, but if you're going to a destination where there isn't a fast train link necessarily with your bike, then you do just need to factor that into your timetable so that you leave enough time. But yeah, certainly it's possible to get anywhere on a train in France, but you do need to know the system, and you need to know where all the connections are and how to utilize the SNCF website booking system as well, so that if you do need to book a train with a bike, then you can exploit that.
Yeah, I've decided that for my trip this summer, if I were to cycle the whole thing, it would be about 5,500 kilometers, and I'm not in any rush. I don't want to rush through places, and I've told myself that actually I'm going to allow myself a maximum of 10 train journeys of no more than 100 kilometers. So that knocks off about 1,000 kilometres if I use them all. So, for example, when I arrive in the north of France, in probably the first week, I reckon I'm probably going to take a train, a regional train, local train from Dunkirk down to Boulogne, missing out kind of the Calais area. Now, obviously, somebody has already told me, why are you doing that? Because you're missing out lots of nice things. But hey, you've got to do it somewhere. I think I'll probably do it in the areas where I've previously cycled, which actually, strangely enough, is not that much of what I'm doing. There are little bits, for example, between La Rochelle and Royan, a bit further south, that I did back in 2015. But there aren't actually many bits that I'm retracing my steps. So that's my plan for this summer.
There are sections of a route, particularly if it's a long route and it's a bit same, that, might get a bit boring, or that you might just not really want to spend the time on. And as an example, there's a bike route that links Bordeaux to Lacanau on the coast. And it's a nice enough route, but it's mostly pine forests and it goes fairly straight from Bordeaux to Lacanau. And it's, in the grand scheme of things of, my top 100 bike routes in France, it wouldn't be on it. So I often say to people, if you're short of time and you just, you don't want to spend a whole day cycling through a pine forest, particularly when you're going to the Atlantic coast, and a lot of the cycling along the Atlantic coast is through pine forest, so you're going to get that anyway. So I often advise people to take a local train from Bordeaux to Arcachon, which is just a little bit further down the coast from Lacanau, and start the ride there. You save a full day of cycling. You get a nice train journey. You get to spend a bit more time potentially in Bordeaux or Arcachon at the other end, and you don't spend a whole day, particularly if the weather's poor or it's too hot even, cycling through a pine forest that really is not that interesting. So there's some clever things you can do to just cut journey times or save your energy, or to save that day or that time for cycling through something that you might be more interested in.
I remember cycling Lacanau to Arcachon back in 2015, and it was one of the worst days for weather. I arrived in Arcachon, I was absolutely soaked to the skin. So I think perhaps looking back, I should have just jumped on a train instead. But anyway, just one last question about the trains. Just in terms of the TGV, one of the problems that we have here in the UK with high speed, he says in inverted commas, high speed trains here in Britain, is that you tend to have to hang your bike up. And it's really inconvenient, especially with a touring bike, especially with panniers. What's the accommodation like in the TGVs for bikes? Is there an area where you can keep them horizontal, or do you have to hang them up?
It depends on the model and the line, and trains are always changing, obviously. So, but certainly the trains on the West Coast, so the ones Paris, Bordeaux, Toulouse, there's a separate section. So you go into the TGV and you do have to carry your bike up 2 steps. So it's like a first class upper level carriage. And the seats are folded up and you just rest your bike along the seats. And there's a little seat belt for the bike. So you wrap it around to make sure it doesn't fall over on the trip. And then your seat that you've reserved will be opposite or in that same section of the carriage. So for the TGV, certainly on that line, it's fairly easy. And it just means you just need to be a bit organized when you get on, because you maybe have to take your panniers off, pop your bike up the stairs and into the seat first, and then just go back and get your panniers, or vice versa. There are other trains. Intercities is an example where there are some intercities train models, and also some TER trains, some local TER trains. We took one recently from Bordeaux to Saint-Emilion. And that train had the hooks where you had to hook your bike up, which can be a bit more difficult, particularly for heavier bikes and electric bikes, where it's a bit more arduous to get your bike up into this hook. But they're very, very rarely busy trains if you're avoiding peak hours. So often you can just rest your bike against the seats anyway. You don't have to use the hooks, and you just tackle your bike to the seat and that's fine. So there's always a way around these things. Unless it's a very, very busy train, I don't think it's always necessary to use the hooks. And people are generally very friendly on the train anyway. I've never come into a situation where I've not been able to put my bike somewhere where I've been comfortable leaving it on a train.
Back to Twitter, there's a chap called Dick Sayers, and he says, I'm doing EV15, which is the Rhine cycle route, in September, starting from Lake Geneva, and want to get there from Calais by train. I know the TGV aren't good for bikes. Well, I think we've kind of covered that. But I can't seem to find any availability on other trains for one man and one bicycle. How do you book train travel with a bike in France? What's the best method?
I suggest his first problem is he's probably putting Calais to, where did you say he was going? Sorry, Andrew, he was going
He's
to
going
Lake
Calais
Geneva.
to Geneva, Lake Geneva.
Geneva. He's probably putting Calais, Geneva into the SNCF Connect website, which is where you book. And the website cannot take multiple legs. It can't process that much with a bike. It will tell you there's no bike availability on that route. So what he needs to do is go back to the map, look at the French rail network and break the journey down. So he needs to go Calais, Paris, for example, book that ticket with his bike, which is just a local TR service, shouldn't need to pay for a bike. And then he needs to look again to go somewhere like Paris, potentially Lyon or Strasbourg, and then across to Geneva from there. So he needs to look individually at each of these legs and book them and search them separately on the SNCF website. A workaround or a little trick here is to use the Deutsche Bahn website, because it can actually process all of the different interchanges. You can't always book your ticket on it because it can't sell multiple journeys or multiple borders or multiple checkpoints or whatever. But you can plan the trip. So you could put Calais to Geneva in, and that will likely bring up the different changes you have to do. And then you could take those changes back and book those legs separately via the SNCF website. So that would be my advice for how to do it. If you go to my website, I've got a bike train page, and then there are links out to individual regional pages. So he'll be able to go to the Rhone Alps page, for example, and see a map of that local network, and then hopefully break the journey down from there.
Yeah, I think that advice about using the Deutsche Bahn website is really good. And I've certainly done that in the past. Their website, which is, I think there's a version which is actually in English. I don't think it's a translation, automatic translation. I think it's a version which they run in English, and it is excellent. And you can use that actually for most trains in Europe. In fact, I dare say it's probably easier to buy a ticket via Deutsche Bahn to go from Halifax to Leeds, which is what I did yesterday, rather than Northern trains. But anyway, there's another transport-related question from somebody who goes by the name of the Black Bike. And he says, with Eurostar not currently taking bikes, that's an ongoing issue, EasyJet cancelling flights and drive-in so expensive due to fuel costs, what is the safest for a bike, quickest and easiest way to get to the south before cycling back home to the UK? Now, I think we've exhausted the trains, but you can get there is a bus, isn't there?
Yes, it's a Bike Express bus. It's great if you're going on that route. The problem being the passengers are quite limited. Obviously, they've only got so many buses or so many routes, however they work it out for their season. And it is in high demand. So if you want to use it, you do need to book quite early, I think, and obviously check early in the season in terms of the flexibility of where you can get on and get off and so forth. But the other option I say to people, particularly at the minute with the Eurostar problem, is that you do have an option to hire a bike here. It's not ideal, and most people, obviously, for obvious reasons, prefer to ride their own bike. But some people do find that it's less hassle, and it can prove less expensive as well if you're shipping your bike out, or if you're putting your bike on an aeroplane, or having to take slower or more expensive trains to accommodate your bike. It can sometimes work out easier and less expensive to just hire a bike here. It just is personal preference.
Yeah. Jennifer Sage, she asked about resources for finding out about bike routes, etc. Now, obviously, there's your website, which is excellent. And we've mentioned the websites which are dedicated for each of the named routes in France, the Vélodyssée, the Vélocénie, things like that. Are there any other resources that you would recommend, online resources?
I'd say look regionally as well. Even those routes that are not long distance routes or technically part of that broader network, the Provence tourism website, for example, is very good. They've got their own Eurovelo URL, which covers a lot of local rides, and increasingly areas in Aquitaine around the Bordeaux area are also increasingly putting more rides, not just GPS rides, but brochures and other maps that you can download or request. It really depends on the area you're going to. And yeah, I think one of the most underutilized resources in terms of cycling is local accommodation providers, because you will find that a lot of them who are catering for cyclists, B&Bs and hotels particularly, and jeets, self-catering jeets, if they're looking for the cycling market, they will have a lot of information locally about cycling. And I think people forget to ask when they book their accommodation, what cycling resources do you have? Do you provide maps? Can you provide me with any local routes? So I would always ask, and that's a common question as well, and a common point I make when people ask about the Tour de France and road closures. They want to go and watch a stage, not sure when the road closes. And a lot of that information is provided quite late in the season by the local tourism authorities because, again, those road closures are regulated locally. So maybe they don't think to broadcast it to an international audience. But certainly, just asking your hotel or your B&B when the road closes is always a good idea, because often there's a sign that's put up down the road telling people when the road will close. And obviously, the B&B owner or the hotel provider is driving past it or riding past it every day. So definitely, I would say it's one of the most underutilized resources is just local people.
Right, a couple more questions to go. Rob Watkins, he wants to know, everyone knows the big routes across France, the Loire, the Rhône, the Vale Odyssey, etc. He'd love to hear about your recommendations for less famous off the beaten track rides.
Okay, well, I would say to Rob, get the map I spoke about earlier, the IGN map that covers all of the local bike routes in France, which is 924, IGN map 924, which is the Veloroute and Voie Verte map. I know Southwest France a lot better than a lot of other areas. I've cycled all over France, but certainly Southwest France is my little home patch. So I would certainly recommend the Tour de Gironde, which is a lesser cycled route than the two canal route that you mentioned, Andrew, and also the Eurovelo one, which goes down the coast. It's the route that goes sort of south of Bordeaux through the Sauternes, some of the lesser cycled vineyard routes in the southwest. That I think is a lovely route. The Tour de Charente I mentioned earlier as well, north of Bordeaux, is lovely. Again, very, very less well traveled. It's, I don't know many people who have ridden it, for example. There's also a Sarthe route which goes through Le Mans and a little bit further north. And that's a figure of 8 route, and that covers quite a few hundred kilometers. And that's a lovely route, again, off the beaten track. There's a newer route called the Flow Velo, which I've ridden, which goes from the Atlantic coast to the Dordogne, north of Bordeaux through the Angoulême area, Cognac, that area. Loosely follows the Charente River, but not particularly. It's not like it's a river route necessarily. And very, very few kilometers on it are actually dedicated bicycle paths. A lot of it is just back roads, quiet back roads where you'll very rarely see a tractor or a car if you're lucky. So that's a lovely route. And again, it goes to the northern section of the Dordogne, so it's not as busy as the southern section of the Dordogne, which can get very, very busy in summer with tourist traffic. So it is a little bit further off the beaten track. But these sorts of routes, they exist all over France. It really, really is a matter of just getting a map, putting a pin in it if you like, or often I will suggest to people, identify what you want to do. Do you like wine? Do you like food? Do you like mountains, hills, vineyards, orchards? What do you want to see on your ride? And then from there, you can start narrowing it down to areas or routes that, do you want a one-way route? Are you interested in war tourism? Do you want to go to the Somme, the D-Day beaches? All of these places have their own dedicated cycling routes. So it really is a matter of trying to narrow it down just a little bit to decide how to find the best route for you. But I don't really, at the end of the day, think there's a bad route, in France. I very rarely do I meet people who I've never met a person, in fact, who's come to France and hated the cycling experience. They've always been pleasantly surprised with what they've seen.
Yeah, I've just checked online, and that map, the France IGN Greenways and Cycle Routes, that's the translation into English. It's map 924, and you can get it from Stanford's. It's £9.50, and it's currently in stock online. After we finish our chat, I'm going to go and buy that. Be quick, because if people listening to this suddenly rush out, Stanford's might run out of copies of that.
You can spread it out. It's more than a meter wide, spread it out. It's just a wonderful map, and it's just lovely just to see how everything connects, and you can choose your own adventure, basically.
That's why I continue to use paper maps, is because it allows you to see the bigger picture. GPS is great, Google Maps, fantastic, but it's a very linear thing, or what you can see on a screen. And I just like to know not just where I'm going, but where I haven't gone and what's over that hill and what,
exactly.
All the things which are potentially detours from where the line on the map is telling me to go if I'm following a particular route.
If you spread this map out, you'll just be amazed by the fact that you can get from X to Y or A to B. Cycling in France doesn't have to be this, wartime effort where you spend months and months and months planning it. And some people do, which is great. And it depends on your cycling style, but it can be a little bit more freewheeling if you like. and you can be a little bit more flexible in how you travel and where you choose to go.
On the subject of which, that brings us perfectly to the question from Connor O'Sullivan. Now, he asks, well, he's clearly a fan of the French Municipal campsite, as am I, because usually they're nice and cheap and they're friendly and they're almost everywhere. But he says, municipal campsites at the end of August, are they worth booking in advance, or is it okay to just arrive when you're only looking for a space for one person, one tent, and one bicycle? What do you recommend there?
For municipal campsites, Connor should be fine at the end of August. It is summer, it is high summer, so it will be busy. But if it's just Connor and his bike, he should generally be okay at a local municipal campsite if he's not interested in too many bells and whistles. So if he just wants a pitch for his bike and himself, he should be fine. What I do say though is that if you are arriving on the day and you're looking for a campsite or a B&B or a hotel in a particular area, particularly if it's in summer, if it's in July and August, and particularly if it's on the coast where all the French people go in the holidays, then just have a backup plan. So if you know that you're going to municipal campsite A, just know that there's a cheap B&B up the road, or that there's another campsite in the next village that you have enough energy and enough daylight to ride to, just in case it's full. One person and their bike should be fine. But I always just say, particularly if you're arriving without a reservation in summer, just make sure that you've got a plan B.
The only place, and I've done a lot of camping in France with the bike, I think in all 3 of my long trips around Europe have involved being in France and cycling through France. And I was only ever once found it difficult to find a place in a campsite, and that was in a place called Castellane in Provence. And I remember going to 2 or 3 campsites, and they did actually turn me away as a single person with one bike and one tent. And I seem to think there was something going on. There was a big festival going on or something. Eventually found a place on a 3rd campsite. But I think and I'm hoping this hasn't changed for 2022, but I think there's kind of an unwritten rule amongst the people who run campsites in France, certainly municipal ones, that they never turn away people who turn up on a bike with a tent later on in the day, because basically they know that if they turn away somebody in a 4x4, they can just drive 50 kilometers down the road and perhaps find something else. If you're on a bike, that's not so easy. So I think there's generally this unwritten rule that they won't do that, and they'll always find a place for you. The other thing I was going to say is that a lot of campsites in France and across the continent, to a certain extent in Britain, they have what they call a free camping area. And very often you'll turn up and the campsite will say, yeah, just put your tent in the area over there. It's not segregated in terms of different emplacements or pitches. It's just an area where you can pitch your tent next to everybody else. Somebody did once read about this in one of my books, and they emailed me saying, where do you find all these free campsites? But it's not free. You still got to pay for them, but it's free as in you can camp wherever you like within a particular area of the campsite.
As you say, I very rarely hear stories of people who arrive late in the day and are turned away, particularly just one bike. It's different if you're arriving, as you say, in a car with 4 bikes or big group of cyclists. But generally, you should be okay. It's just, as you say, if there's an event on or a festival or the Tour de France, for example, you're not going to get a spot. But generally, you should be fine. But yeah, just having a plan B in the back of your mind is always a good option.
And somebody mentioned wild camping. What about wild camping?
Yes, lots of people do it. Not technically allowed, but lots of people do it. And I think as long as you're respectful and you take all your rubbish with you, then you should be fine. There's obviously the ethical debate about whether you're supporting local infrastructure, whether or not, can you really afford €5 or €10 for a campsite to support a local campsite? But not in national parks. You do need to be careful where you go, and obviously be respectful if you're in vineyards or farms, that this is somebody's livelihood and they may not feel comfortable with having you there. So if possible, if you see somebody, just ask. The other halfway point is using a website like Warm Showers, or there's various other Facebook groups or whatever for people wanting to meet other cyclists that host people in the backyard or whatever. That's always a second option as well.
Okay, well, I think that's excellent. Well, we're going to wrap it up in a minute or so, in a couple of minutes. What are your plans? Are you off on the bike anywhere?
I'm not this summer. Hopefully this summer, having been here for COVID, we're hopefully going to see my parents in Australia this summer, but I'm not sure yet. So cycling plans always open, but yeah, hopefully getting out a little bit more in the autumn on my bike this year. Haven't decided where to. I think some of the problem is, as you mentioned earlier, deciding where to go. So getting that map out and planning. But we took an overnight trip recently. My son and I just rode. There's a lovely voie verte from Sauveterre to Bordeaux. It's an old converted railway line, and it forms part of the Entre de Mer, the two canals route you're cycling. It's a converted railway path and it's fabulous. So we did that recently. We rode to Bordeaux and stayed for the night in Bordeaux and then came back home the next day. So just a little one night cycling adventure. So we might do a little bit more of that this year as well, now that the kids are getting a bit bigger. And it's a good way of not having to commit to a long trip, but still take some little overnight or weekend adventures. But and again, that's what part of the ethos of what I like doing really. Like I said at the start, sort of cycling is what you want to make it, whether you want to take a big 1, 2, 3 month trip, or whether you just want to do an overnight trip or just take a day ride somewhere. It's what you want to make it really.
Yep. Our internet connection is getting to the point where it was last Thursday, but I think we've done a pretty good job there in terms of having hopefully a conversation which people can understand. But before you go, can you just remind people where they can find you online, both the website and social media?
Yes, so I'm at www.freewheelingfrance.com is the main website. I also run a Facebook page, Freewheeling France, if you just search that out. And I'm also on Twitter at Freewheel France. I also run a closed Facebook group. So if you search Facebook groups for cycling in France, it should come up, or just follow the links from my Facebook page. It's a private group. So if you have questions or planning advice you'd like to ask, but don't really want to put it in a public forum, it's a good place to be. And it's also a good place to meet other cyclists, particularly independent cyclists, if you're not looking for a tour or anything too structured, or you just have a random question. And my email box is always open. I get dozens and dozens and dozens of emails every week from people just asking for help or advice or just random questions. It's fine, or just to say hello. And I do try to get back to everybody. I can't say 100% I email everybody back if it's really busy, but I do try my best.
Okay, well, excellent. Thank you for kind of dedicating an hour or so of your Sunday morning to doing this, because it's I think that's been really interesting and informative, but also fascinating, learning about cycling in France. So thank you.
Well, there can't be too many good things to do on a Sunday morning than talk about cycling, except maybe actually cycling.
Perfect way to end. Thank you.
All right, take care, Andrew.
Yeah, many thanks to Lyn for taking the time to record that. That was brilliant. Really enjoyed my chat with Lyn this morning. It was quite tricky with the internet connection, but we got there eventually, and hopefully the quality of that in your ears was okay. Now, I did say right at the beginning I would mention my plans in terms of the podcast for this summer, and they're still in my head and they're still kind of changing, but I'm going to be away for 2 months from the beginning of July until the beginning of September. I need to be back at school, back at work in the first week in September. But that doesn't mean that the podcast is going to be dormant, hopefully, for 2 months. Hopefully, I'm going to continue to make some podcasts, but the podcasts that I'll be making will actually have to be made, recorded, edited to a certain extent, actually, while I'm on the continent. Now, I'm not exactly sure how frequent they'll be. I'm not exactly sure how long they'll be. They could be, I don't know, just 5-10 minutes each. Who knows? But they may well change over the course of the summer. They may start in a certain fashion and then completely change by the time I am finishing the trip at some point later in August and early September. But rest assured, my plan for episode 52, 53, 54, I don't know how many I'll make, is to continue making them all through the summer. So watch out for those. Hopefully coming to a podcast provider near you, near your ears, very soon. If you'd like to get in touch with the podcast, you can do so by emailing podcast@cyclingeurope.org or by posting a message either on the website itself, cyclingeurope.org, or via social media, where you'll find me at Cycling Europe. It's also worth pointing out that throughout the course of the summer, throughout July, throughout August, I'll be continuing to do what I did on my previous long trips, and also the shorter ones, which is hopefully to post daily updates, pictures, images, videos, lots of text, obviously, all about the journey so far. You can find all those contact details, by the way, on the website at cyclingeurope.org/contact. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast or have enjoyed any of the previous 50 episodes, then please do consider adding a rating or review on your chosen podcast platform. You might also want to make a donation to help support the podcast and the website, and details as to how to do just that can be found by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. And if you choose to help in that particular way, it would be very much appreciated. So that's it. That is it for the home-based podcasts until the autumn, until September, October time. Hopefully, throughout the summer, as I said, the podcasts should be coming from the continent, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Switzerland, Germany, before I head back into the Netherlands and back to Rotterdam. Perhaps the first one, perhaps the next one, I don't know. Perhaps the next one is number 52. It may be coming from that ferry between Hull and Rotterdam, recorded on the night of the 2nd into the 3rd of July. So keep listening. Thank you for listening. And whatever your plans are for the summer, happy cycling.